When I first saw The Boy and the Heron in cinemas, as a long-time Miyazaki fan, mind you, I thought, respectfully, what the f*** was that? Has the old dog finally lost it? The man is 82 after all. I reclined in the sky blue light emitted by the credit sequence with a small laundry list of confusions. What happened to telling a story? Was our beloved director oblivious to the flagrant retreads of his past material for this latest film? Why the tonal whiplash halfway through? Where was the shining emotional breakthrough that has come to so characterize his work? My nonplussed response to Hayao Miyazaki's swan song was such that I didn't even want to believe that further viewings might shed positive light on deeper meanings contained within. I assumed that the film had a responsibility up front to melt my cynical heart, as did Hal to the heroine Sophie in his own film. Nevertheless, the boy and the heron's oblique form continued to nest in the back of my mind like an unsolved puzzle. After some musing and a little research, I discovered an important key to this film. I sat in frenzied revelation on my third watch, realizing that the meandering plotline of The Boy and the Heron is not the mere vapidity of a star filmmaker who has lost his shine, but actually a cleverly veiled message, full of Miyazaki the auteur's conviction. Many viewers come away from screenings of The Boy and the Heron with a sense that the film is particularly poetic and rather abstract compared to Miyazaki's previous efforts. Indeed, approaching this epic with an overly fixed calibration to the director's preceding storytelling conventions is a great way to relive the disappointment felt by yours truly. However, this hazy-eyed looseness with which the plotline is sketched actually acts as scaffolding for the all-important narrative subtext, which unusually takes center stage in The Boy and the Heron, and is the true material by which late-night cogitations on the enigma of the film's message may be had. About this aforementioned important key, in a musty corner of the internet is a website called ehoba.hatenablog.com. Within this exhaustive compilation of references to Hayao Miyazaki's past works and influences as they pertain to his career finale is this little kernel of interest. It reads as follows: Miyazaki's memo for the film staff clearly says that he's gonna thematize Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex is a theory put forward by Sigmund Freud in 1899, whereby a child holds proto-sexual feelings of desire for their parent of the opposite sex. The child will also be rivalrous towards their same-sex parent for the attention of their desired caregiver. This concept is served as a seed from which the more sweeping colloquialism mummy or daddy issues has grown, and that generally refers to the pathologies which emerge as a result of the lack of appropriate care given by a caregiver. Alas, the film does open with the tragic loss of our protagonist Mahito's mother in a hospital fire. As the first third of the film lumbers by, it is clear that much of Mahito's guarded behavior is a grim consequence of the emotional wound left by that traumatic cessation. During my repeated viewings, as the film begins to stride through its unexpected turns of narrative outlandishness, I wondered if not much more of the film could be puzzled through in relation to that maternal genesis of pain. From Ihoba's blog, in an interview about his own 2008 film Ponyo, Miyazaki said that he has to depict a tragedy of a boy someday. Quote Miyazaki, "I think facing reality brings more pain than happiness, especially in boys' cases. I think boys are tragic entities. If I pursue the true nature of boys, I have to face the difficulty of turning a tragedy into an entertainment." Ihoba goes on to hypothesize that the fundamental difference between Ponyo's happy-go-lucky protagonist, Sosuke, and our plaintive subject, Mahito, is sexual desire. Following on from the catastrophe depicted in the condensed 2.5-minute prologue, Mahito ventures with his father to meet Natsuko, who is introduced as a feminine beauty. Mahito's last piece of expository narration reveals his first thoughts upon setting sight on his new stepmother. She looked exactly like her. The ghost of Mahito's mother is here established as a device by which the boy's behavior, for better or worse, is effected. If we use this Oedipal pining as a lens in our analysis of the film, might we come upon some veiled expressions lurking under the trademarked Studio Ghibli veneer? Enough context is given in this thematically laden scene for us to infer that Mahito's widowed father, Shoichi, has remarried the sister of his deceased former wife. Immediately picking up on our theme, Miyazaki presents a subtle love triangle here, which finds instantiation mainly through Mahito's personal psychology, to which the father is oblivious, and the new matron ambiguous. For the cursory viewer who has not delved into the mystery of the boy and the heron, what I'm about to say might seem implausible, but here goes nothing. Mahito really has it rough here, as the first inclination of his burgeoning teenaged sexuality is projected onto this tabooed recipient modeled in his mother's image. It might seem crazy as the capstone to the director's largely family-friendly catalogue, but perhaps that's why The Boy and the Heron delivers such a cunning farewell. I now offer, dear listener, that the film can be cordoned into 4 distinct sections. The first, in which Mahito's sexual pathology unconsciously haunts him. The second, in which the sexually aware Mahito must now sufferingly integrate this reproductive demon. The third, in which the sexually mature Mahito must reach into the heart of his original mother complex to neutralize its pathology. The final section pertains to the burdenful life choices of an integrated man at the helm of his destiny, as well as a musing on Hayao Miyazaki's own legacy. But first things first. As the initial third of the film wears on, we are witness to an obviously depressed Mahito. Collapsing on his bed, Mahito dreams of his unreachable biological mother. Natsuko enters the room, placing down a tray of water gently so as not to wake her uncustomary stepson. As she pauses to gaze down at the slumbering lad, we see her very ambivalent countenance. Circumstance has shouldered her with the obligation to guardianhood, and she is attempting to meet that fate with all due grace. However, Natsuko's expression belies a doubt which she attempts to conceal, perhaps even from herself. In any case, Natsuko's care for her surrogate son is not the unlimited kind of a real mother, and her alienation will darkly blossom into contempt as the film progresses. After his nap, Mahito brushes with the elusive grey heron, a distantly elegant bird which has recently started to fly closer to the house. The boy's presence disturbs the waterbird, which flitters away to conspicuously enter a grandiose tower. The impressive structure stands staunchly in a state of forgotten disrepair. From the building's substratum peeks a dust-filled opening, which catches Mahito's interest. This section of the film is where the Oedipal theme first really floored me in my third viewing of The Boy and the Heron. The film has, as yet, presented itself as a grounded period drama set in 1940s Japan. What we are about to witness, however, is the first descent into an eventual full submersion of symbolistic communications stated in the film. Therefore, to illustrate the profundity of the impending mise-en-scene, I must present to you, dear listener, a theory which may shock you. So I hope you're sitting down. I believe that the grey heron is Mahito's dick. I know it's hard to swallow, but just behold that pimpled pink lump sticking out of his face. In the characterization of the heron, Our protagonist's masculine sexual drive is symbolically represented, at first unintegrated, an unwelcome intrusion in Mahito's life, and latterly brought into correct relationship as Mahito matures and becomes responsive to the self-determination of his very destiny. Indeed, the film is rife with primordial sexual symbolism, as we will come to see. Though the grey heron is an anthropomorphization of the sexual drive, he is still a stranger to Mahito as well as the audience at this stage in the film's runtime. As such, it is Mahito's unfamiliar, nascent sexual impulse that leads him to visit upon the mystifying impression of his mother's womb, represented here by the shrouded crawl space. The first of 3 repeating vaginal motifs is thusly presented. Over the course of the film, these references will become more explicit as the cruel path of self-development to which Mahito is subjected comes to bear on him psychologically. Into the constricted opening of the tower our hero crouches, shuffling deeper into the curiousness of an unknown knowledge, the kind which, under regular conditions, is kept rightly veiled, but which unavoidably resonates in an unplaceable location within Mahito's heart. At the tunnel's end is an impasse, which the boy attempts to force himself through head first, like a baby being born. Though he can't fit, he glimpses a stairwell curving intriguingly up out of sight to the place where destinies are measured. The tunnel and the stairwell alike are littered with heron feathers, the symbol of archetypically masculine footsteps. A young boy is necessarily roused by such cosmic clues of self-development, but Mahito is yet to realize the painful challenge he is to undertake. The narrative marches on, Mahito accidentally witnessing some hanky-panky between his guardians is played humorously, though his cadaverous lack of interest in school orientation the next morning wordlessly reveals the stress his unrecognized carnal dilemma is afflicting upon him. Cynically wounding himself with a rock, Mahito buys some more time to nurse his emotional wounds. His plans are immediately dashed, however, as the heron comes right to his window to openly mock him. The common idiom of intrusive thoughts is conjured to mind here as the symbol of a repressed sexuality finds a way to poke holes in the sanctuary of Mahito's individual consciousness. I'll just mention, as an aside, note how the convalescent lad requires the help of his stepmother to secure his bedroom window. This is a nice setup for later. Frustration leads Mahito to seek out the source of his ills proactively and attempt to slay the monster where it sleeps, so to speak. This leads to a confrontation with the heron at the lake, the heretofore simmering disconcertion mounting to a head with the ugliness of the heron's identity being finally outed. The unsettling pecker jeers at Mahito, instructing perversely that he will guide Mahito to his mother. In effect, Mahito's masculine urge declares it is pursuant of a depraved inversion of familial roles, as the surrounding cacophony of unnatural events seem to defy the very justness of nature. The raw underpinning of Mahito's immoral Freudian fixation now accosts him directly, and despite the boy being witness to the heron's terrible nature, the bird's insight into Mahito's unearthed impulses plants a bothersome seed of curiosity in that adolescent mind. Like it or lump it, Mahito is now aware of the monstrous sexual impulse that he is to contend with. In the second narrative segment of the film, which will get underway presently, Mahito will come to understand just what that impulse is and effortfully strive to integrate himself with its nature. Of course, that won't just go smoothly. The film is now comfortable with its symbolic subtext, and from here on out, if the audience missed the invite, they will be left loitering outside the party, wondering what the commotion is. Miyazaki seems to have lain down the critical expectation of a standalone film, and instead of condescending to satisfy his audience on narrative terms, has jumped up on the table, dancing wildly to his Spotify playlist. That's what's going on in the party. Mahito is talked into checking on his stepmother, who is now pained by her pregnancy. Touching a hand to Mahito's head wound, Natsuko apologizes and murmurs, "I shouldn't have let you get hurt." The burden of Mahito's lack of emotional acculturation to his new maternal figure is more clearly shown to take its toll on the woman, as she wistfully whispers, "Forgive me, big sister." Natsuko's self-pity and matronly compassion are at odds, such that there is ambiguity over just how much of her dialogue in this scene is in fact addressed to her deceased kin. This scene builds on the ambivalent countenance displayed by Natsuko prior and foreechoes the outright scorn that she will reach in the climactic birthing room sequence. Naively thinking that his newly inherited pathological sexuality can be merely stopped rather than faced up to, Mahito fashions a bow and arrow to attack the heron. Here our hero makes his earliest moves towards self-determination. Locating a few stray heron feathers, Mahito uses them as fletching for his arrow, which now ejaculates uncontrollably from him upon use, in one of many callbacks to Miyazaki's professional body of work, in this case Ashitaka's Cursed Power in 1997's Princess Mononoke. The pubertal masturbatory undertone of this scene does not go unnoticed here, as the literal grasping of the symbol of his sexual drive proves difficult for the young juvenile to handle. I remember being that age. Mahito spots a figure slinking off into the forest, although he takes little heed. For the first time, Natsuko has left the crosshairs of Mahito's pathological attention, as its very root has now gripped the boy. This psychic absence coincides with Natsuko's physical absence and points to the tower's alchemical properties. Yes. Mahito presently knocks down a stack of books and discovers the 1937 Japanese novel How Do You Live, addressed in his mother's handwriting to grown-up Mahito. Composer Joe Hisaishi's poignant score highlights this afterworld bridging one last offering of true maternal love as Mahito tearfully pores through the book's pages, reflecting by the grace of his mother on his own self-centeredness and resolving to face his fate full-heartedly. Upon realizing that the now missing Natsuko is in critical need of his care, as opposed to just baseline care, which she needed from the narrative outset, Mahito, in a spirited act of independence, closes the study window on his own without the help of his guardian, as occurred previously. With the protesting Granny Kiriko in tow, our hero approaches an entrance to the magical tower, emblazoned overhead with a quote from Dante's Divine Comedy, Facimi la divina potestate, which translates notably to "divine power created me." Of course, once Mahito enters completely into the tower's mystery, the narrative shifts gears into full theatre of the mind presentation, and with the tower later explained to have essentially fallen from the sky, where it stands straddling many worlds, Miyazaki seems to be tackling the ineffable source of the circumstances of life into which human beings are cast. There are, of course, elements of the spirit felt personally in our own lives, which seem to defy the tools of rational explanation. For instance, have you ever tried communicating verbally to a friend your real-time attempt to predict the order in which the very words you say will come out of your mouth? I find it impossible to do so, and yet the logos of whatever I focus on seems to automatically organize itself into the linearity of oral language, pointing to an animating spirit beyond the boundaries of my own consciousness. Why don't you try it at home? The grey heron goads Mahto into encountering a forged copy of his mother's figure. When Mahto grievingly touches its form, the imitation dissipates, and the heron comments that he could always just remake her. If we follow the symbolism through, we could guess that Mahto's sexuality is inclined to project the tragic genesis of his sexual yearning onto an outward subject, by which Mahto would be inevitably transfixed at this stage in his development. Even when the illusion is hypothetically shattered by Mahto's grasping, his sexuality would nevertheless resume its function, that is, until the behavior is ultimately resolved through Mahto's conscious differentiation of his inner motivations, sexual, emotional, and narrative alike. Such an endeavor seems to be the main task carried out by Mahto in The Boy and the Heron. The figure Mahto spied entering the forest just a few scenes earlier, presumably Natsuko, shares an identical appearance with the fake body Mahto now encounters, which may point to the mechanics of his very conundrum in action. As an aside, assuming Mahto's fantasy projection onto Natsuko has rendered her somewhat of a toy and prevented Mahto from truly seeing her in her full human essence, we can start to understand the source of Natsuko's misery. After Mahto aggresses the heron, effectively communicating to his own sexuality that it cannot tyrannically subsume him, the Tower Master bodes from on high and instructs his avian emissary to stop mucking about. Now the psychological fantasy commences in earnest, with Kiriko's comical cries breaking up the dense subject matter. Mahto soon delves deeper into the mystery of his mother's womb. This time, having overcome the first hurdle of sexual integration, the vision is clearer. An imposing tombstone represents a vaginal opening, topped with pubic evergreens in this second symbolic manifestation of maternal sex. In contrast to the cobwebby crevice seen prior, this image stands invitingly agape. Two bodies of water stretch out like open thighs, but with this advance in carnal awareness comes a moral injunction. A golden gate stands between Mahto's person and the enrapturing vision behind in a clear representation of chastity. The brilliance of the front gate exudes importance and a warning against seeking out the secrets it guards at risk of death. Yet Mahto is cursed by fate. Peering through at the intimidating tomb's interior, Mahto comes to consciously register the subject of his unavoidable desire. Therein shines the mystery of all-knowing, the magical elixir of life, the place from which all men come, the infinity of cosmic understanding in its unmediated form, too much for any man to live to bear, and yet ever tempting, ever alluring. Why, oh why, did this depraved fascination have to be the form in which the heavens appear to Mahto? All this registered in a second before the patterns of nature, manifest as the pelicans, compel him ever closer, crashing past this golden keeper of temperance and foretelling of the taboo that will occur later in the film. The integration phase of Mahto's sexual development continues with just pretty much Mahto getting laid. The young doppelganger Kiriko is representative of the archetype of the lover, and through her erotic guidance, Mahito will be able to stand as a coherent sexual entity. It is entirely appropriate for a lover to rescue a young man from languishing in the alluring trap of his psychosexual arrested development. Kiriko, a strong, individuated, rather masculine seafarer, does just that. She gallops across the shore and wards off the antagonizing pelicans with fire. A prayer is then offered to the cosmic womb tomb, the hallowed image of both death and birth, and thusly the transgression of the gate is purified anew. This again forecasts the taboo of the film's latter half. The pair set off on Kiriko's yacht, with the towering woman procuring Mahito a second time from the onslaught of whitewater. Thus begins the romance. Seeing Mahito's scar, Kiriko lets loose a knowing laugh, acknowledging that she too bears the mark of injurious self-development. She mentions that it was a swamp thrasher that got her. And I question how accurate the translation is here, because if the allusion holds, I mean, swamp thrasher. Swamp thrasher. I'd really like to thrash Kiriko's swamp, if you know what I mean. Oh, and as an aside, Kiriko mentions that the scores of yachts on the horizon are not real. I have a hypothesis about that, but more on that later. Next, a very suggestive scene plays out. Facing one another, the pair pull down in heaving, synchronized thrusts on a rope pulley. With each rending movement, the most phallic fish ever depicted in a cartoon stands ever more erect. For the duration of the whole voyage with Kiriko, all I can really say is, yes, it is what you think it is. Following this exercise, dialogue continues, with Kiriko engaging in the kind of flirtatious brain-picking that is shared by lovers. The couple then begin to be pursued by merchants who outnumber them by multitudes, empty bowls in hand. I offer, dear listener, that these fellows may represent suitors. After all, to be crude, women are indeed in possession of an item much sought after by the male sex at large, represented in this context by Kiriko's aquatic booty. That is fish. Mahito and Kiriko arrive at the latter's living quarters, a gigantic ark which obviously calls to mind the biblical story of Noah, wherein a very small group foster the seeds of new life to be released and flourish. That is exactly what will happen between our two lovebirds, as, leaving behind the suitors with a respectful nod from Mahito, they star in the boy and the heron's most overt sex scene. So the wara, fledgling souls who are yet to be born in the human realm, gather happily in droves to dine on the result of Kiriko and Mahito's union, spilling everywhere like little gametes. The two work in tandem to heave the maritime monster ashore and set the conditions for a successful gutting. Kiriko, the seasoned angler, sits astride the fish and assertively pierces into it with a knife, where the camera lingers just long enough to get yet another vaginal impression as the rough flesh slits open, revealing a lubricated pink crevice. The wara revel, watching the sequence that will lead to their eventual birth play out. Mahito follows in turn, gingerly prodding the fleshy beast as Kiriko's firm instructions bellow off-screen, and I kid you not. Right there, deeper, pull hard. I mean, it's obscene. Blood spurts graphically into Mahito's face, and he is eventually covered in fish guts, which burst forth in orgasmic climax, rendering him limp. Considering Kiriko's domineering disposition, One wonders whether old Miyazaki ever gifted his wife a whip for a birthday present. I don't know. Maybe he did. The next morning, Mahito awakes under the approving vision of the granny dolls, which all correspond to the grannies at the residence. They have, "Oh yeah, I know what went down last night, nice," looks on their faces. Of course, the grannies have had sexual journeys of their own in their time. I'm sorry for saying that line. And now bless Mahito with their praising mediation, as is the traditional dignified role of community elders. Mahito gets up and drinks a cup of water in exactly the manner of one who just got some pootie tang. He's like a shriveled plant receiving the first autumn rains. He's like, ugh. Ugh. He's like that. Mahito is becoming a man in and of himself, a far cry from the uninitiated sexual juvenile he started as. He addresses Kiriko, who replies, "How do you know my damn name?" in the hyper-informal manner of those who share intimacy. As an aside, she has hilariously fixed Mahito the most undelicious-looking Studio Ghibli dish of all time. Mahito ventures outside for a wee-wee in the outhouse on the surface of the ark as the half-moon illuminates a grouping of trees that look suspiciously like the pubic ones above the tombstone pussy from earlier. Well fed from the lover's consummation, the wada wada ascend into the sky, extending the biblical seed of life narrative. Kiriko emerges to tearfully see off their offspring moments before those antagonizing pelicans swoop in to munch on their babies Pac-Man style. Now the theme of cyclical nature becomes ever more pronounced as the next generation is picked off like juvenile crabs making their mad dash to the ocean. After Himi the Fire Maiden is briefly introduced as a protective force, the surviving Wada Wada spray past the moon in a clear, symbolic reference to fertilization. The film soon changes gears for a bit. Mahito sees a lone pelican hunched over, ravaged by the preceding fire. He speaks to Mahito. "Young one, put me out of my misery. My wings are too damaged to work. My kind was brought to this hellscape to eat the Wada Wada. The sea has few fish we can eat and we're all starving. We flew as high and as far as the wind could carry us, but it always ended the same way. We could only reach this island. Now our newborns have forgotten how to fly. The sea here is cursed. The Fire Maiden burns us." This sequence seemed to me, even on my first watch, to be an insert from Miyazaki himself reflecting on modernity. The man has appeared in documentaries like The Kingdom of Dreams and Madness, where he muses on the futility of making entertainment in a world that is falling apart. Our ancestors strived forward on a dream, but modernity has left us up front to the brutal puzzle of filling our social structures, let alone individual lives, with meaning. Miyazaki himself does have a nihilistic streak, and his attempts to overcome it have led to some of his most poignant later works of film. Nevertheless, the problem of teaching our children bold, resonating, human stories gets more challenging in a world of ever-increasing convenience. We have a surplus of advanced tools, but confusion over what end to use them in service of. The heron arrives and is humbled by Mahito's ritualistic act of respect in burying the pelican. Somehow you can dig into a wooden ark. Apparently, I didn't know that. Moreover, the grey heron is impressed by Mahito's sudden evolution as a young man rather than a boy. The Heron's old tricks are ineffective at overpowering Mahito, whose identity can now veritably contend with his sexuality, and in fact, in the very next scene, which references Miyazaki's 1978 serialized television show Future Boy Conan, the very next scene shows an inversion of status where the boy attempts to tyrannize his sexuality, i.e. the Heron. Of course, existing in rebellious opposition to one's own sexuality is a bad long-term strategy, just as trying to stamp it out altogether, as in the confrontation with the bow and arrow, is ultimately a pointless endeavor. Kiriko resolves this in her final act as the lover by seeing the worth in Mahito as both childlike spirit and sexual being. She unites these disparate elements of Mahito's identity for the better. Plus, Mahito receives a little keepsake to remember his old flame by. Nice. This newfound kinship between Mahito and the Grey Heron is indicative of a pivotal shift in Mahito's comfort with his own admittedly imperfect sexuality, as the two now work together without external help. The boy is able to confidently exert his masculine drive onto the world without its unruly disobedience, an essential mark of adult wayfaring. With the two setting out on a delightfully schlocky action adventure, the third and penultimate arc of the narrative begins. In this segment of the film, Mahito is challenged with the substance of his maternal attachment. This complex acts upon his sexuality and corrupts it, but with Mahito now able to see the value in collaborating with the baser elements of his individual composition, the true source of his misery is revealed. Mahito will ultimately rise forth to psychologically neutralize the negative impact conferred by his disturbed longing. With Mahito able to autonomously act as a man, the implications of society now seep into the boy's experience with the introduction of the parakeets. I can imagine Mr. Miyazaki amusing himself with their creepy Sesame Street-like appearance, very unusual for an anime feature film. But the basic geometric shapes in which they are rendered mesh well with their role as simplified expression of society. I hypothesize that these multicolored birds are an extension of a metaphor first proposed in Kiriko's earlier comment about the yachts. During the throes of Mahito's spiritual consternation, the notion of society was but an obscure impression, with the yachts on the horizon said to be immaterial. With Mahito well on his way to becoming a fully individuated being, this increasingly overt representation of society is put forth in parakeet form. We could conject to draw a line from the symbolic function of the parakeets to Mahito's re-entry into society writ large, with the destruction of the magical tower fully expressing the sequential metaphor. The visual divide between yachts and stupid Sesame Street parakeets is admittedly a wide one. However, the thematic allusions sustained elsewhere by the boy and the heron do invite speculation. In any case, what follows is definitely another powerful symbolic moment. The heron contrives to create a diversion, flapping about maniacally to draw the parakeets away from the millwork in which they reside. Although ambushed by the avian comrades inside, whose nasal breathing just cracked me up on each successive viewing of the film, Mahito comes face to face with Hime, whose face pokes out from flame a la 2004's Howl's Moving Castle. Hime then transports Mahito to her abode. In other words, having brought his own sexuality into a healthy relational balance, Mahito is then able to let it go. And it is under that condition that he meets the virginal image of his mother in a state of loving peace. No longer the object of Mahito's carnal lust, Hime shares with the boy a blissful tete-a-tete, with Mahito basking in the lost, nostalgic beauty of sun-kissed moments spent together. Some viewers bemoan the lack of excitement shown by Mahito in this scene. The boy barely reacts upon realizing that Natsuko is the maiden's younger sister, but these are the complaints of the aforementioned loiterers who missed the invite to the party. Mahito has already come quite a distance into resolving his grieving desire, and it is his consequent light grip on things as an individual in spiritual rehabilitation that invites the spirit of his mother to visit kindly upon him. As for me, what I interpreted as just another phoned-in Studio Ghibli dining scene on my first watch completely transformed into one of the most touching moments of the film, given the symbolic context. In this moment of poetic reverie, the pressures of society revert to the trivial form of yachts seen outside the pleasant tea room window. I'm not completely certain on this metaphor, but let me know what you think about it. The Fire Maiden shortly whisks Mahito down to the corridor of time. Under the astral skyscape decorating the ceiling, Mahito is offered a chance to ponder on his spiritual journey. He has come very far along, and this point in time may be a reasonable one for Mahito to put down his soul-searching and rejoin the constancy of the real world. He may always be afflicted by maternal loss, but with his sexuality in check, perhaps he could carve out a life. Another reference to Howl's Moving Castle, this time its magical doorway is hard to miss here, in addition to the character's optical transparency, as in 2001's Spirited Away. Determining that his trials of the heart are yet to be overcome, Mahito scampers yet further into the mystery of his mother's womb, aided now by the sexually sublimating effect of the Fire Maiden's unprofaned presence. Pink, effervescent walls are penetrated by the protagonistic couple as the film juxtaposes the mounting pressure of societal orderliness via the parakeet's clockwork civilization in this third and most undisguised vaginal encounter. Electric sparks emitted from the walls recall the nasty frogs and fish formerly conjured by the heron as the boy's actions run counter to the orthodox carryings on of nature. In this final sinful visitation, Mahito is not excused by the alibi of ignorance. The boy has painstakingly brought his sexuality into the domain of his conscious influence. This is no accidental encounter with the profane. Himi warns Mahito in non-partisan fashion that the tower is unhappy with his actions, and yet Mahito resolves, despite the warning of the Golden Gate, to stare down the formidable nucleus of his haunting maternal pathology. The two soon stand before a tremendously ornate curtain, which Mahito crosses through alone to initiate his fateful showdown, deaf to the protesting of nature's sparking descent. In the stark stillness of the birthing room, Natsuko now lies prostrate. The imagery calls to mind stepmother and son's most recent interaction, but this time the self-aware boy is determined to riskily open his heart. Paper strips hover above the scene in circular formation, and when Mahito rouses his laboring guardian, the sheafs whip into a frenzy, and yet another reference to Miyazaki's Academy Award-winning Spirited Away. Not so obvious is the appearance of the stone tomb, this time watching over the scene from behind Natsuko's bed rather than behind the Golden Gate of Chastity as before. The unfriendly, antipathetic path of fate onto which Mahito has been thrown must necessarily desecrate that which is proper, and it is before the judgment of this great mother portal to the celestial that Mahito measures his own destiny. Upon waking, Natsuko is outraged by Mahito's presence, the words "I hate you" spewing violently forth in her guttural cry. Mahito urges the woman to return to reality with him amid the chaotic slashing of 1,000 paper cuts, the indignity of nature mounting one last retaliation against Mahito's objective. The boy's next action is of utmost significance. Mahito now calls Natsuko by the title of Mother, effectively transmuting their shared trauma into acceptance and collapsing the ghostly shadow of his biological mother's unavailable love. Taken aback by Mahito's unexpected show of humanity, Natsuko shouts in mercy for the boy to avoid the injurious physical lashing taking place, though his biological mother is deceased in waking life. Her spirit springs eternal, and it is into the arms of its maidenly figure Mahito collapses. The young Hime, coursing with the undying flame of maternal care, demands an end to the hysterical animosity being shown by nature itself, and the gnashing of the paper correspondingly subsides. In effect, Hisako's motherly spirit acts as arbitrator between the godly expectations of nature above and the sacrilegious specificity of action below, which Mahito has been forced to commit. Natsuko's unconscious body lies now covered in the symbol of ejaculate, with the vaginal tomb looming ominously behind. Mahito's sickness of the spirit is now neutralized. No longer will his actions be warped by pathological yearning for his mother, but what of the boy himself? The cursed truth of Mahito's shameful plight is now manifest in offering to the Empyrean stone portal, and the atmosphere turns glacial as, dear listener, we can but hope for the permittance of God. The question of whether Mahito actually partook in licentious relations with his stepmother can be fairly simply answered with a negatory, as far as I'm concerned. Needless to say, the duo's ability to healthily coexist would be muchly compromised in such a case. I believe Mahito had to bravely bring his full psychological and spiritual attention to bear on his infantile perversion in order to examine it, come to know its nature, and consequently neutralize it, despite its deterring nastiness. From the filmmaker's perspective, the graphic visual metaphor of semen seems an effective choice for the very connotation of the despicable context in which it is placed. Kiriko, the archetype of the lover, did indeed initiate Mahito into the sexual world, and the boy indelibly held this knowledge to his strength in the birthing room. In the wreckage of An Evening Well Spent, Hime calls her sister to accept Mahito as her son. The offering of desecration is not acknowledged without consequence, however, and the stone tomb launches an offensive attack on the three characters, rendering them unconscious. The ornate curtains close on the scene, putting an end to the third chapter and signaling the real climax of the film, at least in the opinion of key animator Toshiyuki Inori. Toshiyuki Inori. The parakeets filter in behind the closed curtains like little tongue-in-cheek stage technicians who double as extras when needed. Mahito and Hime have landed in a compromising clump, perhaps pointing to Hime's role as virginal protector expiring, or to Mahito's lusting grief having ended. The figures did not scatter haphazardly, and their resulting orientation draws attention given the lingering camera. When working on The Wind Rises, Miyazaki reflected that he doesn't think about why he's making a film when he's engaged in the process itself. His process is freewheeling, and Miyazaki grapples to resolve his films as he constructs the storyboards. Perhaps this explains a few symbolic ends left loosely defined in a film of the boy and the heron's thematic magnitude. Whatever the case, Mahito wakes in a kind of meta-conscious dream surrounded by light impressions, somehow both cosmic and headachy. Before him is a pyramidal opening emitting golden luminescence, which, with its referential electric sparking quality, seems to act as an astonishing inversion of the vaginal tropes littered throughout The Boy and the Heron. I'm actually reminded a bit of the ending of Mal Stewart's 1971 rendition of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, of all things. wherein Charlie's show of humility flips the script and causes him to unexpectedly inherit the entire chocolate factory. This is a transcendent moment for Mahito. Archetypal heroes are often depicted in literature and mythology to be just in transgressing norms, if oriented in the correct stead. And it seems, despite his breach of the Golden Gate, or perhaps indeed because of his stoic willingness to breach it despite the odds, Mahito has been deemed worthy of admittance into the very mystery of creation. The characterization of the granduncle seems to serve a dual function. His rendezvous with Mahito conjures the image of a walk with God, and it is through their interaction that Mahito ultimately resolves to live for the sake of his friends and family and for today. But with the Oedipal problem wrapped up, the film performs a bit of a duck-footed thematic maneuver, the wizened old Tower Master being used instrumentally to address the director's filmic legacy, as well as his approaching expiration. Seen in this light, the references to past films now warrant inclusion. Mahito waits patiently after the old master at work. The stacked white pebbles under the granduncle's care apparently represent the fragility of the balance in which reality hangs, but with the man's efforts able to keep the stones stable for a mere day at a time, I'm reminded of the aging Miyazaki's waning powers. Studio Ghibli producer Toshio Suzuki stated in a December 2019 interview with NHK that Hayao Miyazaki's pace of production for The Boy and the Heron could produce a measly 1 minute of animation per month, a far cry from his erstwhile output. The pair venture outside to the place where they did the Windows XP photo shoot. Here, Mr. Granduncle reveals the source of his powers, a seed-like floating rock containing smouldering embers. In Miyazaki's The Wind Rises, master aircraft designer Giovanni Caproni states that every engineer has his 10 years in the sun. The stone in the heart of the artist seems to be giving little water, and Miyazaki's diligent block stacking can only keep the beautiful dream of Studio Ghibli alive for so long. Those familiar with the history of the Japanese animation studio will be aware of its struggle to secure a successor. Choice candidate Yoshifumi Kondo regrettably died of an aneurysm in 1998. Hayao Miyazaki's own son Goro has displayed an uneasy relationship with the role of successor, and many other promising directors have been driven away due to the harsh demands placed upon them by Ghibli's doctrinal culture. The declining granduncle requests that his descendant take his post, but Mahito responds defiantly. Stating that the white stacking blocks are made from stone, by which tombs are created, Mahito opines the notion to be malicious. Mahito's course of development has been a grossly injurious one, necessitating his improper dealings with the symbolic tombs of before. If indeed the colossal path of fate itself is a byproduct of this childish Jenga game, it is easy for us to understand the boy's grievances. Why should such pains exist in the world? It's something we've all asked ourselves, and Mahito's objection impresses the godlike elder, who in turn places his trusting judgment upon the boy. Mahito wakes, having been detained by the parakeets during his spiritual sleep. The heron then busts onto the scene, accoutred in variety store disguise, to rescue the boy and resume their popcorn-munching action. We can only guess what silliness the heron has been up to since his last appearance, and I'd love for Miyazaki to tackle the issue in a Ghibli museum short. Watching Mahito and the heron bash Sesame Street parakeets senseless with oversized leg bones just never gets old. The Rainbow Bird Brigade seems to have organized itself into a political proletariat, and knowing Miyazaki's pessimism in regards to modernity, I wonder if their multicolored denomination alludes to any current day phenomena. In regards to the parakeet community as symbolic corollary for the boy and the heron's real-world society, their mirroring of the militarization depicted at the film's outset might also support the hypothesis. The heron tells Mahito that The Fruit Loops-looking society is going to try to take control of the magical tower, with Mahito's sacrilegious taboo having provided the perfect excuse for their ulterior pursuit of power to be let loose. Some critics say the character of the Parakeet King is but a shoehorned deus ex machina, but I think that's the wrong way to look at it. The phenomenon of the parakeets as a whole constitutes a loosely drawn single character in the film. And the thing about groups of people is, of course, they mount a coup d'etat while you're looking the other way. Hey! Mahito, now trusting the heron, follows him diligently through some pretty questionably bug-infested shoots. I do hope the symbolic role of the heron is mostly wrapped up by now. A callback to 1979's Castle of Cagliostro follows before the Parakeet King, tailed by his two loyal subjects and the unconscious Hime, hubristically breaches the luminescent portal to the heavens. This time it zaps the crap out of its intruders in protest, as the king demonically demands the acquiescence of nature. This is in contrast to the earned worthiness determined of Mahito during his passage. The kingly parakeet diplomatically corners the granduncle on his slipping competence and delivers Hime as an esteemed gift, with Mahito's transgression rendering the bird's domineering will to power all but justified. However, the royal bird greatly underestimates the power of the conceptual figure with whom he convenes. As in real life, the Parakeet King's failure to comprehend the organizing principle under which his power games must submit will ultimately lead to the dissolution of the entire context on which his avian society has mounted its cultural identity. Before long, Mahito emotionally reunites with Hime, and the boy and girl brave the looming threat of cataclysmic destruction, the heron and Parakeet King stalking close behind. This brings us to the unlockable true ending of The Boy and the Heron, wherein Mahito provides an answer to its Japanese namesake, how do you live? Having seen the film, dear listener, you'll know that the granduncle has scoured the ends of the earth to find 13 white blocks free from malicious contaminants. The old bugger appeals one last time to our hero to take hold of this utopian vision and preside gloriously over the Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole universe of the magical tower. Mahito, of course, rejects the offer, shrewdly stating that the scar upon his temple is a sign of the malice contained within his own heart. By recognizing this insightful truth, Mahito goes beyond the healing over of his maternal trauma and casts away his resentful victimhood status altogether, promising to live heartily. When working on his penultimate art piece, The Wind Rises, Miyazaki seemed to be incessantly motivated by an underlying conviction. That being, quote, that people must live their lives fully, with all their might, within their given boundaries in their own era. What was a propelling factor for that film's lead, Jiro Horikoshi, has been now synthesized into a resounding decision in Mahito, who, unlike his protagonistic predecessor, does not weepingly concede the fact, but calmly exudes it from the bottom of his young heart. Miyazaki seems to be reviewing his life's work and observing that such a humble endeavor is all he has ever done. Live as fully as possible, Miyazaki states. That's all we can do. Hayao Miyazaki has long since abandoned the Marxist and socialist political affiliations of his idealistic youth. The short-sightedness displayed by the parakeets and soon to be encapsulated in the forthcoming final act of their king seems to reflect the director's 1994 claim that, quote, leaving decisions up to the collective wisdom of the masses just results in collective foolishness. The Parakeet King does not seem to be the kind of individual to lower himself in humility to painfully address the motivating causes of his own actions. In contrast, Mahito has put in the hard yards to build himself from the ground up, ensuring his guiding principle remain as humbly close to God as could evidently be, such a path being the very antithesis of blind bandwagon hopping in pursuit of an ill-conceived goal. The aforementioned unease with which Miyazaki's son Goro has shouldered the claim to the Ghibli throne also seems to receive a graceful acknowledgement. The strained relationship between the two Miyazakis can be easily projected onto the characters in this scene. The senior of the two obliging his son and yielding to the reality of a differing life course, one that, in the final analysis, is up to the individual only to decide. That notion of the successor's autonomy adds an interestingly reflective twist to the aging animator's take on an archetypal tale of individuation. The rescue of the dead father is a common mythological trope, as Joseph Campbell illustrates in The Hero with a Thousand Faces. By rescuing the father from the belly of the beast, so to speak, such as in the tale of Pinocchio, a protagonist revivifies his grounding in an ancestral narrative and takes his father's place as its newest avatar. In The Boy and the Heron, however, the archetypal father is seemingly both rescued and defied. Mahito's final proclamation of independence is made in opposition to the ossified husk of the moribund granduncle's old dream. It cements Mahito as torchbearer for the future, but by the same token, sets the old man free. The granduncle, though depicted as serene progenitor, ever so subtly reflects the qualities of what may serve as the Boy and the Heron's closest thing to a villain for Mahito to vanquish in this final philosophical joust. The sincerely delicate tact with which this conflict is handled evidently speaks of Mahito's deserved candidacy for his nevertheless refused position of lordship. But of course, this is all steamrolled by the conceited desire for power anyway, as the Parakeet King perfectly demonstrates his unenlightened ignorance. There's always one, isn't there? And especially against such world-defining stakes. The oversized bird decides it's his turn to play with the blocks and ends the game for everyone. Amongst the fantastic carousel of Miyazaki's cynical truths, the fact that the Parakeet King's narcissistic destruction does not ultimately obstruct Mahito's chance to live fully provides a silver lining for us viewers to ponder on. The golden promise of a better tomorrow can indeed be snatched from the gnashing jaws of chaos, as Mahito demonstrates. In another unexpected Willy Wonka-esque script flipping, the granduncle harks our protagonist flee to safety as the graceful old geezer passes away in a last act of acceptant benevolence. The old man seems to be a bit of a postmodern self-insert of Hayao Miyazaki. With his passing, the future is transferred to those willing to nobly carry their burdens. The wonderful fantasy of the tower is ending, and when our beloved pig-faced storyteller too passes on, the future of the animation studio he co-founded remains to be seen. When we all voyage into the unending astral knowledge from whence we came, the constitution of our own worlds, as we see them, similarly break down. Depicted on screen is a bold stare down against the inevitable, but perhaps that's to be expected of the stubbornly practical, stubbornly human Miyazaki. Shit proceeds to get biblical as our unlikely heroes pass through a calamitous parting ocean. The world splits into pieces, with the revered stacking blocks thusly rendered inert as they float off trivially into the vestiges of eternity. But the film has one last bittersweet card to play, with the characters hastening back through the corridor of time to resume their lives fully within their own boundaries in their given eras. An entreating appeal to love is voiced. Mahito urges Hime to live alongside him, but the maiden is courageously set on fulfilling Miyazaki's creedal treatise. When Mahito bemoans his mother's impending doom by hospital fire, she is only emboldened, willing to lay down her life in order to beget the soul of a young boy who would do her so proudly. Mahito has become a brilliant participant in the world, not only unshackled from the detriment of his initial pathological yearning, but now powerfully enervated by the unflinching faith of his mother's true spirit. Hime wishes her grown-up younger sister well in her own childbearing, in a touching metaphysical union of the familial image, before sincerely locking eyes with her son one last time. All the relevant characters flood back into reality as the second of two collapsing buildings bookends the film, putting a full stop on the end of the narrative opened by the hospital inferno. Not only does the disintegrating building confirm Mahito's triumph over his maternal demon, but its quintessentially Studio Ghibli painterliness heralds the end of an era for the studio itself. The pelicans and parakeets also resume their regular posts, closing the circuit on the wicked creatures of the lake, which previously defied holy order. The heron briefly stops to encourage that Mahito forget his adventure in the tower and let the wound of his past fully scar over before acknowledging their friendship and making his leave. There you have it. Mahito is ready to face the world. The Boy and the Heron is as strident a statement as could be made, though it may not be apparent at first. Delving into his own tortuous psychic history, Miyazaki has managed to address one of the deepest ills of the spirit. Many a man must silently struggle against the nature of one's own sexuality, finding its whims to be frustratingly defiant of his own dominion. And when that unruly spirit travels down a path such as would garner shame, rejection, and even devastation, the struggle may turn desperate. Hayao Miyazaki has bravely greeted the face of despicable torment and acted as a paragon of psychological reconciliation, all the while deftly nesting the frankly repugnant subject matter in a package that is typically beautiful, if not a little perplexing. As a standalone film, The Boy and the Heron does not rise to the level of greatness as catalogue hits like Princess Mononoke and Whisper of the Heart. However, Mahito's final decision to be who he is and live fully in that honest understanding stands as a fitting conclusion to the body of text that is the Miyazaki oeuvre. The film meanders at times and its pacing is not textbook filmic success. The Boy and the Heron seems to actively shirk those expectations, however, in lieu of its own pursuits. In that respect, the film sets the standard, and to appreciate it, viewers need the correct context. I personally feel that to understand the film, one needs to A. be familiar with the Studio Ghibli catalogue, B. have an understanding on Hayao Miyazaki the man, for which I would recommend NHK's 10 Years with Hayao Miyazaki and The Kingdom of Dreams and Madness, and C. needs to consider the main theme of the film, an Oedipal struggle, though that final part, the key, is nowhere to be observed online or in the promotional materials. The Boy and the Heron is a journal entry. Although its author is still here with us, it feels like a final reflection on growth, pain, the tapestry of life and death itself, and what makes a man, as is reflected in the Japanese title. The scene where Mahito reads the titular novel plays like a fractal image of the Boy and the Heron's role in the lives of Miyazaki's young admirers. The film will be his parting gift, and rightly observed, it is a message of encouragement, all that despite Miyazaki's apprehensive blindness to the future. Even when the granduncle passes away, he is calling in support of Mahito, the one who defied him, but ultimately the one who does succeed him in whatever pursuit he is called to uptake. What else but encouragement does an old man have to impart? When you see the heron feathers littering the staircase which curves up out of sight, you know people have lived brilliantly before you. Lived fully in the face of instability and short-sighted destruction. Lived fully, with all their might, within their given boundaries in their own era. The Boy and the Heron does not doubt that you too will live fully. In fact, Miyazaki seems to accept the proposition that every generation must. Instead, the film asks earnestly, how will you do it?